In this lecture, we're going to give an introduction to the HapKit board, both the functionality of the board, basic circuits that will let you connect to the board, as well as how to program it. So this is your HapKit, looking at it from several views, and in all the views you can see the HapKit board. And you should by now have your HapKit completely assembled and have the motor connected. You may not have the force-sensitive resistor, it's shown here, right here, hooked up yet, but at least the motor should be connected at this point. So this is what the anatomy of the HapKit board is when you look at it from what's considered the front, the stuff with all of the electronic components. Let's just walk through all of these different components. On one side, we have the motor leads, and these are positive and negative going to the motor. And basically the HapKit board will generate a current which will drive the motor to turn. And we'll examine how that motor works in another lecture. The next step is the connector for the force-sensitive resistor, which we haven't used or set up yet, but when you do hook it in, you'll be adding it to this component right here. And then there are a bunch of pins, both down here, all of these pins here, as well as these pins on the top, which are available for reading and writing. And when we look at the back side of the board, we'll look at more detail in terms of what those pins do. Now on the left side of the front of the board, let's start from the bottom, we have a power LED. LED, as we'll see later, stands for light emitting diode, and it basically just means it's a little light that will turn on, in this case, when the board is powered. And you can get power both through the USB from your computer as well as from the power adapter for the motor. So if you expect that your board is plugged in, whether it's to the power adapter for the motor or through the USB, you should see this light up as a green LED. The next thing is this big black box, and that is the connector for the power adapter for the motor. We're actually not going to need to use that until we start trying to actuate your HapKit. But you will need to use very soon your micro USB connector. So with your HapKit comes a USB cable which has a typical USB interface on one side to hook up to your computer, and on the other side a micro USB to hook onto the board. Do be a little bit careful when you hook your USB connector in here, because that micro USB connector is awfully small and it would be possible to wrench it off the board if you're not careful. We chose a small one just so we could package everything really tightly onto the HapKit board, but as a consequence it has a somewhat delicate micro USB connector. And the final thing I want to show you on the front of the board is this reset button right here. And that reset button can be pressed if you want to restart whatever program is running on your HapKit board. Sometimes this can be a good thing if the program is doing something unexpected and the motor is spinning wildly and you want to get it to stop. So that is definitely one way to quickly at least pause the behavior of whatever your system is doing and have it reset. Another thing that you can do if something bad is happening is disconnect whatever's your power source, whether that's coming from the power adapter from the motor or the USB connector. So let's now look at the HapKit board back and the components there. So we basically just flipped the board over around a vertical axis, and now we're looking at the back side. So let's start on this side where the leads to the motors are, and you can actually see here, and hopefully notice this when you put your HapKit together, that you're hooking that motor into leads M1 plus and M1 minus. And so these labels here are handy because it lets you know which one's positive, which one's negative, and you know that this is for motor 1 and these two here are for motor 2. Even though your HapKit only has one motor, the board has functionality for 2 motors if you wanted to add something. The next thing on the back here is the MR sensor. MR stands for magnetoresistive. And this is a sensor that we added onto the board post-production. And it's going to sense the rotating magnetic field from the magnet that's attached to the motor on your HapKit. So let's skip over to the right side now and look at this port. This is a micro SD card port. Not something that we're going to use this week, but it could be used in the future to record data if you want to. So it's just a way to store data that there might not be enough room for storage on the processor on the HapKit board. So it's just like micro SD cards that get used in cameras and other computer peripherals that you might have. What we're showing down here is the micro USB connector from the other side. So you can't really see it, but you can just see the pins that are holding it down there. And finally, you can see a little bit of the power connector, the connector for the power adapter for the motor. So the last thing I wanted to point out is the pins. So we have all of these pins here on top and all of these pins here on bottom, which have black pins on the other side so that you can put wires into them and either input a signal or read a signal. Now on the top we have the digital input-output pins. So those are pins that can either be high or low, where we think of low as approximately 0 volts and high as approximately 5 volts of voltage. And then on the bottom are analog input-output pins. Actually, I shouldn't have circled the whole thing. It's really just these are the analog input-output pins, and those can be used to take signals that usually range between 0 and 5 volts. These pins over here are actually other power and ground pins, so you can just see them. They're labeled as they need to be, as ground, for example, or 5 volts, or even a 3-volt line.